Hello and welcome to the Wakpadan Bassett Creek Oral History Podcast, where our guests discuss ways that they and other indigenous peoples have lived, worked, and played in the Wakpadan watershed for thousands of years. This project was created in Minnesota Makoche, or Minnesota, the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. The project was co-led by Dr. Casey Keeler and Crystal Boyd, with support from community partners. More information is included at the end of this episode. On behalf of everyone who contributed to this project, thank you for tuning in.
So good morning, Cathee. How are you today?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
Good, thank you so much. So I am joined this morning by Cathee Vick for the Wakpadan Bassett Creek Oral History Project. So we had a chance to connect on the phone last week, so you know a little bit about this project and what it's about. So the first question I want to begin with is, when and for how long have you lived or worked in the area surrounding Bassett Creek?
Pretty much my whole life, about 59 years.
You are, out of all the interviews we've done thus far, you have been in this area the longest.
Wow.
So I'm excited to hear your perspective on this. Knowing that you've been in this Bassett Creek, Wakpadan area for about 59 years, what brought you and or your family to this area?
Well, we moved here. We moved from Crystal to Crystal when I was just a little girl. And I was probably 3 years old when we moved closer to Bassett Creek in Crystal. And Crystal is an area where Golden Valley's like 2 blocks away, Robbinsdale's a block away in the area that we were on. We were right off of 36 and 100, Highway 100. And so my parents bought a home, and it was they call it a slab house, but back in the 60s, it was affordable. And so my parents bought a home, and that's why we moved to 35th and 35th Avenue North, and which is just blocks away from Bassett Creek.
What brought your family to Crystal?
Well, my mom and dad were married. Dad grew up in Northeast Minneapolis, and mom grew up in Minneapolis and then St. Paul. My mother grew up in an orphanage. She was put in an orphanage with her 3 sisters when they were very young, and they came out of the orphanage when it closed and went back with her mother and lived in Duluth. And then her mother moved to Minneapolis, and thus they met. My mom and dad met, and they moved to Crystal because it was close proximity to Minneapolis, yet it was a suburb, and it was affordable, and there were lots of neighborhoods with children. And I come from a pretty large family. I have 5 brothers and sisters. And so they really were looking for an affordable home that they could raise their children in. And so Crystal, being so close to Minneapolis, which they were very familiar with and working in, made all the difference.
I feel like hearing your story of your family experience moving to Crystal, the Bassett Creek area, about 60 years ago was so similar to my own story. My husband and I purchased our first home in Crystal, just off of Highway 100 and 42nd.
Okay.
So like the next exit.
Yeah.
In 2012. And we lived there for about 5 years before I finished my PhD and coming to Wisconsin. But very same story, coming out of the recession. Crystal was affordable, the close proximity to Minneapolis, where we were both working, me being in graduate school.
Yeah,
I
it's
miss that
centrally
area.
located. It's with the Highway
Right.
100 and being so close to Minneapolis, it really, it was a good place.
Right. And as you mentioned, you're blocks away from so many other cities, suburbs.
Yeah.
I would go on runs when we lived in Crystal and I was in better shape. And I would come home and I would tell my husband, oh, I ran through Crystal, I ran through Golden Valley, I ran through Robbinsdale.
New Hope. Yeah.
Yes, they're all just intertangled there.
Yeah.
So when you moved to this area, did you attend school? Where did you go? And were you and or anybody else in your family involved in Indian education programming through the school districts?
Okay. I went to Noble School for kindergarten, and then I went to Lee Elementary, off of 36th and Noble for first grade through sixth. And then I went to Robbinsdale Junior High. And in Robbinsdale Junior High, our house caught on fire. And so our house actually burned down. And so then we moved right off of Victory Memorial Drive over North Minneapolis. We rented a home before we actually found a home to buy before that. And I do not recall. And so then I went to Patrick Henry.
Mm-hmm.
But all my siblings, the older siblings, I'm number 4 out of 6. And my older siblings went to Robbinsdale all the way through. So they went through to the Robbinsdale Senior High.
Mm-hmm.
I was in 8th grade, and in 8th grade, you went through the middle school, right off of 42nd, where you were talking to, where those townhomes are now. That's where the junior high was.
Okay.
But then, so I finished 8th grade, and then in Robbinsdale, you went, and Minneapolis. Wait a minute, Robbinsdale, I would have actually gone to the junior high through 9th grade. But in Minneapolis, then you started school 9 through 12.
Okay, for high school.
Yes, for high school. I do not recall any Indian education. Subsequently, my grandchildren live in Robbinsdale. I have one lives in Robbinsdale, my son and his family, and then my other son lives in New Hope. Okay. There have now been Indian education programs in the schools today.
Were your 2 children involved in any Indian education programs?
No.
Wow. It will be interesting. And now I want to go look to see when they began in Robbinsdale, because I also feel like Robbinsdale has a pretty noteworthy Indian education program.
Yeah. My children did not, and my children, they went to, I did live in Hopkins with my kids for a bit. So they went to school in the Hopkins School District. And there was no Indian education in that I recall with them.
Yeah.
But with my grandkids, there is Indian education.
Right.
Well, I think there could be some improvements, and the comments that they have made about the program, it's been enriching for them. But it's a good first step, I think.
Right. I think I maybe shared this with you last week, but I went through the Indian education program in Anoka Hennepin School District growing up. And then I also worked for the Indian education program in Anoka Hennepin after I finished my bachelor degree. And I think for so many of those K through 12 students, it's one way that they're able to connect to a larger American Indian community. There's lots of improvements, obviously, that can be made, particularly in public education and funding Indian education. But it was one avenue for students to have that cultural connection. And some students had stronger community ties than others. But it was, I think, one thing that was consistent for a lot of the youth, and that was consistent for me as well. I know another person I interviewed for this project went to school in Minnetonka, and she also did not recall Indian education programming. So now, again, I want to kind of look to see these different areas, if they've had them and when they began.
Yeah, it's interesting. My grandkids have mentioned, that they learn the information and histories of others.
Mhm.
And so they were really curious why others didn't learn about them and why they were segregated. They didn't use the word segregated, but they were separated, and they wondered why it wasn't for their whole class to learn about.
Right. So when the students are pulled from their regular classes for the Indian education programming.
Right, where they learn in our history about, the Holocaust. They learn about slavery. They learn about, so they're like, we learn about everybody else, but they don't learn about us. We're learning about us and our culture, but so it was an interesting comment from kids.
Right, to have that kind of recognition.
Yeah.
That is a really important point to think about, is why isn't American Indian history incorporated into curriculum for all students?
Yeah, I think it can be someday.
Especially in these native places, like the Wakpadan, Bassett Creek area.
Yeah, I get chills just when you say the name.
Mm-hmm.
And where I currently live backs up to the creek, which I played in as a little girl. And oh boy, it was so fun. But when I lived in Robbinsdale, closer to North Memorial, before I moved to this home that backs up to Bassett Creek, and my husband happened to be driving through the neighborhood and saw this house and the property. It's just under a half acre.
Oh, wow. That's a good sized lot for this area.
It is, to be in the, close to this, being in a city, even though it's a suburb, and then backing up to the creek that I grew up on and swam in and caught crayfish. But when I walked onto the property, it was, the term I might use would be mystical. It was wooded and it was overgrown because the people who owned the home had passed. And so it was vacant for a year before we got it. And the home really was not a home that I was like, oh, I have to have a split level house. It was the land that spoke to me. I could see the trees in the winter with snow on them, and this was summer. And it was just a calling that this is where I should live and connect. And so I've had some really supernatural experiences with the land and with our native relatives, because land holds a memory. And so I knew that this was inhabited at one point by the Dakotas. And maybe, I don't know that they lived right there because it's a swampy area, but I know it was traveled. I know it was, I know they lived very close, and it was inhabited by Dakota.
Yeah, I'm so excited to hear more about this. And I also believe I shared with you that on June 4th, there'll be a community-wide event to celebrate this project. And if you're able to attend that, I'm really hopeful to introduce you to Jim Rock, who's Dakota, and his wife, Roxanne Gould, who live in Golden Valley as well and have so much knowledge and history to share of this region. And I know they'd be excited to hear your experience of living right along the creek as well.
Yeah.
So this kind of guides me to another set of questions and thinking about the geography of this place. So when you think of the Bassett Creek area, do you relate to this region as a Native person, if at all? And you kind of hinted at this in your previous response.
Yes, absolutely. As I said, when I walked on the property, first of all, the familiarity with the creek and the place of my upbringing and the fondness of playing in the creek and just having a place that was the wooded area with the watershed. We had and so, yeah, definitely. As I spoke a little bit about, I had some supernatural is the only way I can put it, in touch with the Native side, because I am Ojibwe, but also in my lineage is Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's probably a little teeny big toe, but it's a woman her name was, we named her Sioux Woman. That was the translation from what the name was. She was married to a great grandfather. And it would be the Metawakan tribe,
Mm-hmm.
which that's who she belonged to. And growing up, I'm a light skin. I'm only a quarter Indian.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the blood quantum issues and the recording of us early on,
Mm-hmm.
I fall under where I'm not a member of our tribe. The 3 younger siblings are not, and the 3 older siblings of my family are members of White Earth. Okay. And so I always felt a little disconnected until moving into the home that I live in now and had the supernatural experiences. I think everybody might be familiar with the book Indian in the Cupboard. But I actually have pictures of me with my grandkids sitting on a bench, and behind me is the house and sliding doors. And my husband was taking a series of pictures of me with 4 of my grandsons. And so he was standing in front of me taking these pictures. The house is behind me. And I chose a specific one of the group of these pictures to put as my screensaver.
Mm-hmm.
And on my laptop. And for about a year, I kept having this thought of, look in the window. And I would argue with myself. And I would think, no, I'm not going to look in the window. I'd look at the picture of me with my kids, my grandkids. And finally, one day, that compelling thought to look in the window, the sliding glass window behind me. And when I did, there are natives in the image of this window.
Wow. In the reflection almost.
Yes, it looks like an X-ray. So
Wow.
the features, like their cheekbones and even a big war bonnet. And there's many. And then when I chose this picture, which is nearing the end, because I wanted to find one where the kids were looking at the camera and they were smiling. I wanted a smiling picture of them. And so as I went through the series, in the image in the window, all the natives were, they were profiled.
Okay.
And as the series of pictures went, you watch the image change till they all were facing straight on. And in a lot of the research with that, because I was just astounded at this, of course, and thinking, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And why me? I was the, least expected to work in Indian housing with my family. My mother being in Indian housing since she worked for the state. She worked for Little Earth, and she created the first Indian housing home buying program in the nation.
Wow.
And received funding. And so her name is Donna Fairbanks. and Donna Folstead back in the day, but she changed it back to her mother's maiden name. So it was pretty interesting. And through some of the research of trying to figure out who are these natives, because some of them are very identifiable in the pictures. And one of them is Charles Eastman, which is a Dakota, and he was an author and an activist, and so it's just amazing to me to think here they are, and they're behind me, but with me.
So now every time you look at this picture, this is what you see.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And I shared it with some folks with Red Lake. Of course, I've shared it with my family members, and we feel like one of the images is my great-grandfather, who was my screensaver on my phone, my wallpaper, whatever it's called. And he's in his war bonnet in one of the pictures that we so cherish. And so it's just, it really began this spiritual side of myself in connection with this land and who I am and what runs through my veins.
Right. And I think it's also a reminder that this is an Indigenous place.
Yes.
And that your relatives are with you, our community members are with you.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
It's kind of crazy, but it was real.
Right. So you do have this real connection, in particular when you move to the home that you currently live in, and everyday reminders, it sounds like, as well.
Absolutely.
So you've told me previously a little bit about your work. Do you work in Minneapolis? Do you travel a bit for work?
Yes, I'm actually self-employed and I'm an independent contractor. So I do, right now I have a contract where I'm working with Little Earth Housing as a housing navigator. And it's funded through AmeriCorps Heading Home Corps. But I have a contract through the National Indian Housing Council. And so I'm contracted, and that's where I would do the travel. So Little Earth Housing is in Minneapolis, and it's the only housing that's specific for Native in the country. But then my other work, if I travel, I do home buying education training, I do team building training, Board of Commissioner training for all Indian housing entities. And that's brought me all over the country.
Wow.
Yeah, but because of the pandemic, HUD closed, of course, all travel as well as airlines and everybody else. So it was really stagnant for the 2 years. So I really hadn't done anything. And I noticed in LinkedIn that Little Earth, well, it was AmeriCorps, was looking for housing navigators and in specific for Little Earth. And so I was like, ooh, this is a natural fit. And I'm not doing any consulting because of the travel restrictions. And so, and with Native people, it's, not all, please, we're on Zoom, we're both Native, but with the type of trainings that I do, it's important to build that relationship of trust, because coming into the business of housing especially is so personal, and I work with so many different tribes that it's that one-on-one time that makes a difference. So I work in Minneapolis until August. My contract is up. However, they're looking for funding to keep me.
That would be so nice.
I know, that's so exciting, and they'll still let me keep my contract through NEIHC, so that if I'm needed, then they'd give me the grace to be able to go do that as well.
Yeah, there's so many housing needs across American Indian communities on and off reservation. So this is going off the questions list. I apologize, but I'm interested in knowing through your work, do you primarily work with American Indian people in urban areas, reservation communities, or rural areas, or in suburbs, or like a mix of these geographical residential places? Because here you are living in Golden Valley, an inner ring suburb, a predominantly white suburb, but working with a highly recognizable urban Indian community, both
Yeah.
of which are native indigenous Dakota places.
Yes, absolutely. I prior to this, I have done it varies, but I do mostly work on reservations.
Okay.
So here is the first long stint of working with a urban area of Native people. I did try back in 2013. I came here with my sister, and we offered the executive director that we would volunteer. So any trainings we do, we would volunteer our time and help people just become for home buyer readiness, for financial wellness, do credit counseling, to open the doors for some of the people and the folks living here in the city. And it wasn't accepted. They didn't do it. So I know it's come full circle because here I am.
Right.
And it's definitely different than the natives that I work with on reservations. While they're more, I think the term Indianish is something that I come across, especially in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
So with many of the tribes in Minnesota that I've worked with, you'll find that the natives are some quiet and don't want to speak real loud. And so I've done a lot of training in that area because while I'm shy in the social end, in business, I am outgoing and boisterous. And so I've done lots of training to help. I've trained trainers. So like they want to introduce financial wellness and home buying education on with their members. And so that's been instrumental. I got to spend a summer going back and forth to Red Lake. And oh my gosh, I got to even go to Panema. And in Red Lake, Panema is like right between the two lakes. And it's a very sacred area. And you don't drive there, even though you can, because it's an open reservation, even though it's
right.
But you wouldn't go there uninvited.
Mm-hmm.
And because many people, the first language, English is their second language.
Right.
And so I've had some really good experiences. And through that summer, I've got to see the trainers that I trained who were very quiet in their speech and not to be good morning, how are you? And speaking in front of groups of 250 at the Indian housing conferences around the country. And one of the women is actually running as a council person for her tribe. So it's wonderful.
That's very exciting. I spent one summer going back and forth doing research at Red Lake as well. And maybe it was the same summer as you, but it was so nice to be able to be up there, surrounded by community, learning. And of course, it's just beautiful.
Yes.
As well.
It really, really
but
is.
I think Red Lake has done some really good work in housing in Minneapolis in recent years in their construction of their affordable housing complex as well.
Yeah, they are known in Indian country. They are a perfect example of how to run a program. And I'm the two people who run the program, Red Lake Reservation Housing Authority, are my mentors, Jane Barrett and Linda Adams McGraw. They're dear friends of my mother's, and thus they became dear friends and mentors to me.
That must be so nice to see
Yeah.
how everything's unfolding and the work they're continuing to do for their community.
Absolutely. And they're so willing to help other tribes with best practices and challenges that they've faced and how they handled them. And I know they came into the housing authority, it has to be over 20 years ago, and it was not the way it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And they really built this program with ethics and integrity and pride, and they've really just built that reputation that so many of our other tribes have and do model after.
Right. I think housing too is such an important place or area to research and to have more conversations about and provide more education about, because it really is something that a lot of Native communities have maybe struggled with. And in my own research, I'm not sure if I've shared this with you before, in my own research, I really look at this historical trajectory of what I call federal Indian housing policy that begins with treaty making and removal and the creation of reservation systems, because that's all linked to today's access or lack thereof.
Yes.
Of housing on reservation and off reservation.
And gaining that understanding, like within our reservation, and I'm sure others, that the housing on the reservation, it's like, it's a HUD house.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not like our house. It's
Right.
a HUD house, and therefore it's unlearning that, no, it may have been built with HUD dollars, but this is our house, our reservation's home, that people can start their journey and get on their feet and move on to their own home.
Right.
And you can own a home even off the reservation.
Right. And there's programs that can help you.
Exactly. And it's like, well, we're taught, because I was an urban Indian. I am an urban Indian. But there's that mindset of, well, you're an urban Indian, you're concrete Indian. You don't really understand. You don't live on the res, you don't understand that. And it's like, well, I think we both could learn from each other and unlearn from each other. And so it's just opening the mind of, they're taught, a lot of folks that I've have spoken to have, said, we're taught to get an education and go back to our reservation and utilize our education to help. And while that's a good practice and necessary, you can also, out of 6 kids, maybe one of the kids wants to move to California.
Mm-hmm.
Or Florida, or wants to be a movie star, or, whatever it is, that just opening your mind to the possibility of home ownership somewhere else, or home ownership at all.
Right. And you are living, in an urban and suburban area and still working with the Native community. So it's work that can also be done off reservation.
Absolutely. One day I was sitting in my living room and I had the windows open. It was a really cool evening. And I've shared about some supernatural things that have happened. Well, all of a sudden I hear powwow music. And I'm thinking, this is crazy. Am I like going crazy? So I'm listening, and it turns out And then it was like 2 minutes and it stopped. And it was specific powwow music. It was the drums and singing. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I'm backed up to woods. Yes, there's a house, but in the summer you can't even see the house. And yes, there are other houses to the side. But about 3 months later, I was looking out my window and it was winter now. And there was a teepee in the backyard kitty corner from my house behind me, and away from the creek kitty corner. And it was like, oh my gosh. And I saw some people walking in the woods not long after that. And here it turns out a Native family moved in there and they were doing ceremony.
Wow.
And so the teepee was up for about, it was less than a week, but I figured out that's where the powwow music was coming from.
Wow. I feel like there's just so many connections.
And they were Dakota.
Yeah.
And maybe it's, if you said this other people live in this area, and it could be the same people, Rock, the last name.
Yeah, Jim Rock and
Jim Rock.
and
It could be where he lives.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
but it may
I
be.
was thinking that when you were sharing this story, because they have shared, when I did the interview with them, they do ceremony.
Yeah.
So once the recording stops, we'll have to figure it out if they are indeed your neighbors, because I do know where they live. When my husband and I bought our house in Crystal, not far from where you live, within that first week of living there, I was doing something inside, unpacking probably, and my husband was outside, but he comes running in. He's like, Casey, there's like an Indian guy that lives behind us. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, he's wearing one of those like ribbon shirts, I'm like, what? Oh, he's got long hair and a ponytail. I'm just like, what? Like, these are all these stereotypes. So I come up and I look, and I was like, oh yeah, I think he is Native. And the gentleman was working in his backyard, and we had a fence that separated our yards. But over time, I came to realize that was Dave Larson.
Okay.
And I don't think they lived there full time. So they were always kind of like hit and miss. They weren't there a whole lot. And when I moved to Madison, the street that I live on, just up the road from me, is a Native woman. Well, she has since moved. They just moved this past summer, but she was a Ho-Chunk woman who is a journalist, pretty well known, worked for Madison Magazine, but most recently has transitioned to go on to become the CEO of Indian Country Today.
Oh, cool.
I know. So here we are in these like very white suburban places.
Yes.
But there are Native community members. So this leads me back to the questions and thinking about, how has living in the Bassett Creek area informed your identity, if at all, as a suburb, and thinking about being a Native person in these really white environments away from reservation communities?
It brings me to, because of the land and the creek being right there, and the woods and the wildlife, and it's hard to separate the thoughts of the past, of how we lived and what we were allowed, and that's such a sad word, allowed to do, with ceremony, with hunting, with gathering, with our medicines. And it's affected me in the way that I honor the past with it, but it saddens me in the sense that there aren't more natives, and that, if you, let's say, you may get stopped by the police if you went and did a ceremony, or questioned, what are you doing? Because I was walking behind and gathering and looking And I had people, and it wasn't their property, it's public land, but I had people actually stop, what are you doing? What are you doing back there? And it was just so strange to me. And thinking about, I'm just walking and I'm just looking, and actually I was picking up garbage. As I noticed in the woods, I thought, well, I'm out here and gee, I noticed a lot of trash. So I just started gathering the trash and just spending time. So it's really just being in that predominantly white area. I, of course, don't want to offend anybody, and I don't want to scare anybody just by my simple walking through the woods. I actually sent a card to the people, because they live like 2 houses down from me, and it was woods right there. And it was a man, and he was like, what are you doing? And he was so upset. And I was like, well, if this bothers you, I'm just, throwing trash. And, but I won't do it. I'll go back home. And I sent him a card with a big crane. I mean, a beautiful, beautiful card, just saying, I didn't mean to frighten you, and I'm your neighbor, and I own my home. And I just felt like I was justifying my
presence
being, yes, my presence, and just, yeah.
And doing something really responsible, which is caring for the land and caring for the watershed, which has been so polluted.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, but I still wanted to, I didn't want an enemy. I mean, we had lived there for 10 years. And, it's lots of young people are moving in. We're like the oldies. But he was an oldie. He said, I've been living here he was just, and he was arguing. I said, sir, you hear what I'm saying? I'm not arguing. I would be happy to move along.
And not pick up the garbage.
Right, and not pick up the trash. That I see lots of things that I think, no, I'm just kidding, that you have thrown back here. But, I still didn't want an enemy out of him. It's still that, I think that, I've done lots of thought about, because I wasn't raised any religion. My mother grew up in the orphanage, and it was Catholic nuns that were very cruel. And my father grew up, and they were poor, but they never really had religion. And so I yearned for something. And so I became a Christian. But that left me with many questions of God and hell, and how would all of that. And so, but I think we carry that DNA. And my sister really helped me open up, because anything with spirituality or woo-hoo stuff, my older sister really helped me open my mind, because she would talk about past lives. And I believe it's through this awakening, moving actually on the creek.
Right.
In 2005, that helped me open it up. And it's like, well, what's a past life? Is that DNA that runs in us? That I have my grandfather's laugh or this or that. And then it went further in my thought process of the trauma.
Right.
And the some of the characteristics I carry.
And we do know that historical trauma is passed in DNA.
Yes, absolutely. So some of my quirks of home, I just want to be with my family.
Right.
And I'm a homesick kid. I always, I think it's just all that. My grandmother was in a boarding school in Tacoma, Wisconsin. And so,
I think, right. And knowing the history of your grandma and even your mom.
Oh my God, yes.
Not necessarily having a I'm going to say words that might not be accurate, so feel free to correct me, but not having like a safe and stable home,
Yes.
something you've almost yearned for, and now you have,
Yes.
and making sure that you protect that through good relations with neighbors who might not always be kind.
Yes. Yes. And judgmental of, because we've been called every name in the book, as a family, because we were different growing up in Crystal, and my grandmother, who lost the kids and my mom went to the orphanage, she was not proud to be Indian. She was, she's half Indian, and she was sent to the boarding school in Toma, and my mother embraced it. Out of her, the three girls, that my mom comes from three girls, and she's the youngest, and she's the only one who embraced being Native. And my grandmother drove her crazy. But there were many things that my grandmother didn't speak about.
Right.
So,
Because she was taught not to in the boarding schools.
And so, she was a lefty. And in boarding school, she had her hand tied to her arm, and she could not. Yes. And my mother's a lefty. So even seeing my mother write with her left hand would drive my grandma crazy.
Wow.
Just trigger those thoughts of beatings on her hand, and then being tied so that she was forced to use the right hand because the left was evil and savage and crazy. I became very close with my grandma for the last 10 years of her life. But she never mentioned the boarding school. All the stories I've got is once grandma passed was from my mother.
And only then did your mom speak of it, probably.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because it was just too painful for grandma. So, yeah, but she's on the other side. And in subsequent pictures that I've taken of the sliding door windows, I've got my grandmother, her face, she showed herself in that window in a whole different series of pictures. And she's with her family, and she's proud of who she's able to be in the spirit world, who she was all along.
And she's still with you.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you have these photographs, these contemporary photographs, to connect you with the past.
Yeah, and when I first saw it, I thought, what's Carrie doing in the window? Because my older sister looks identical to my grandmother. And then my oldest sister, she looks identical to my Norwegian grandmother.
It's funny how that works in families.
And it's like, that's not Carrie, that's grandma. But she's young. She's not 86 years old, grandma. She showed herself young.
Do any of your siblings live in the Wakpadan area?
My brother, no, he actually lives off of Minnehaha.
Okay.
No.
I was wondering, because if they did, I would ask if they had similar kind of connections to the past as you've been having as well.
It's my sister Carrie, the one who looks just like grandma. She lived in Minnetonka, and now she lives in Duluth part-time, and she lives in Florida half the time. But then that Duluth connection with the Ojibwe. But no, I'm the only one. I think again, it's that home.
Right.
I'm
a
driving down the
you.
streets that I rode my bicycle. The home that I live in, I actually trick-or-treated at.
Oh my goodness.
And I remember the last year I was 14, taking my brother and sister. And this was the rich part of our neighborhood because we grew up in the slab homes. And then two blocks over was Golden Valley. And then the nice homes started with basements and, more than one level. And yeah, the guy who lived there, I remember we were going to the door and saying trick or treat. And he looked at me and said, "Aren't you too old?" I was just like, "Stop, put the candy in the bag."
Yeah.
And it's just crazy to think this is where I'm living in that sense.
Right.
But yeah, it's something, it drew my husband. Then when I saw the land, and it was just like, just these pictures started. And it's actually in the back of our house, there's a dry, it's now permanently wet because they opened up the big field behind our house. It was all woods and then the creek. Well, then they opened a big water reservoir because all the rainwater drains down to our area, thus the valley. And so they made a big water reservoir behind our house, and at the end of our block, the city bought a couple of the houses and tore them down because they were eroding into the creek and losing land. But so we have a little vein of the creek right in our yard. So I've got ducks and wood ducks and mallard and oh my gosh, and every bird you can think of, and fox and deer, and
a good habitat.
Yeah, really, really beautiful.
So Wakpadan is the Dakota name for Bassett Creek. What do you think about the role and importance of language and place names, particularly in these predominantly white settler spaces?
I love it. It's like, even when you say it, I get chills on my legs. And that's always been an indicator of spirit touching me to say, this is good. This is just good. And I love the way you say it. I have to learn how to say it.
I think as this oral history project has progressed, my pronunciation has evolved.
Well, you say it well.
Thank you.
Beautiful. And so I do think it's very important, and I do, it resonates, and that in a predominantly white area, that it's even open to do this is a miracle.
Right. This also leads to my next question then. So this American Indian Oral History Project grew out of a land acknowledgement process done by the Valley Community Presbyterian Church in Golden Valley. So what do you think about land acknowledgement statements? And after the work has been done to actually create the statement, what do you see as necessary or supplemental follow-up work that should also be done?
Well, I've thought a lot about this in reading the questions, and I've talked with some folks too to get some perspectives of some elders, and I think that the land acknowledgement is important, but there seems to be labels in there that maybe doesn't resonate as much, is the nicest way I can put it. But it's still a land acknowledgement. And so it's so important, but just being careful with labels woven within that land acknowledgement. But as far as it's really, what do I see going further would be more free access to the space without being, hey, what are you doing? Or having the police called, for ceremony, for picking our medicines, for without harassment.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's a big ask,
Right.
because people live all on the edges and most aren't native.
Mm-hmm.
But I think an awareness of the land acknowledgement and bringing that acknowledgement that these are ways that if you see someone doing a ceremony, that you don't have to be afraid
Right.
and protective of, this is my land, even though it's not really your land, it's
Mm-hmm.
public land. And we once did this freely.
Right. I was thinking so much about land when you were talking about this neighbor previously as well, is that these really Euro-American kind of conceptions of land property, land ownership are so rigid.
Yes.
And what that entails and what that means in terms of exclusion and lack of access as well.
Yeah. Going, wow, a person's just walking in the woods and you're upset
Mm-hmm.
and yelling and not listening, because I was,
Right.
I'll do whatever.
This was probably during the day and you don't seem like a very threatening person.
Right. Now, for all fairness, I did have camouflage stuff on because I think it was probably early spring. So while there wasn't snow on the ground, but you could see. And again, I was just going back there and I think I might have been looking for sheds because I found many antlers. And then noticing trash. And so it was just so startling to have somebody so upset about it. But again, I was just hands up and, oh, it's okay.
Right.
It's okay.
You don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. So it's like, so my own, so I think that the land acknowledgement will help in that more awareness that there
Right.
are people that are native that live in our community and that should be
Right.
like,
Right. So even some of these land acknowledgement statements coming from larger organizations or institutions can do a lot for individuals, non-native individuals in that community, also then recognizing that longer history, but also contemporary connection.
yes.
And the access, free access, much more
Absolutely.
accessible access. If that makes sense, accessible access.
It does. It totally does. And I really think Jim Rock is the kitty corner neighbor behind me when I'm sitting here thinking about it.
Not the one that yelled at you though.
No, this is no, this is on the side of me, but
Yeah.
they're like not far from Jim. And I believe that's where it is. And the craziest part with this, I'm sorry to go off track, but it's just in my mind because the house that I live in, the split level house, the builder who built it, well, the house that did the ceremony and had the teepee, and then I saw their kids looking in the woods for, they had a drone that they had lost. And so they were in the woods right behind my house, and I certainly didn't go back and go, what are you doing back here? You know, I was happened to be in the backyard and just said, hi, how are you? You guys looking for something, you know, and wanted to help. But and then I learned about them, but it's their home is the same builder built the home. It's like we have identical houses even, which is just kind of crazy because I had looked online to see what does that house, oh my gosh, it's like it's a mirror image of my home.
Wow. Such a small world.
Yeah.
So, in thinking about the watershed in the environmental aspect of it, what advice would you like to give to those who help manage and steward the Wakpadan Bassett Creek watershed in the area today? Are there any particular initiatives or changes you would like to see?
You know, it's it seems to me in that there is great care in this. I think really just continuing to honor it and to keep it clean. You know, like I said, because we're in Golden Valley, we have a lot of water running to us from other cities, and just making sure that that is cared for in a way that it's not negatively affecting.
Yeah. Caring for the environment a little bit more, it sounds like.
Yes, because it is so beautiful and so important.
Right. And it's not just this one creek. There's lots of,
yes, that go to it. The runoff from everything goes to it. And making sure that we're not just getting everybody else's polluted runoff, whatever that runoff is.
Right. Like your house on the creek is only one house. What about everything else that's along it? Businesses, golf courses, and private property.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would like future generations to know about your experience as a Native person growing up in a place like growing up in a place like the Wakpadan watershed, these predominantly white suburbs?
Just how precious this is in for children to be able to go in this water and play and explore and safely, and that it's clean, that your kids don't have to worry about disease being in it. And then all of the wildlife that depends on this water, and from the rocks to the crayfish to the fish to the ducks to the geese to the everything that's connected to this. But as a person, for children, I think especially, to be able to explore like I did.
Right.
You know, we had picnics. We would pack a little lunch and ride our bikes down Lilac Drive, it was called. And we'd ride, 4 blocks to the creek, and we'd spend the whole day. And back in the woods, one part of the creek, because it wound through the woods, and there was a tire swing. And so or a rope swing, we jump in. I mean, we just had to be able to do that for future generations.
Yeah, I feel like these last two questions almost go hand in hand, and thinking about like the care of the watershed and thinking about future generations of Native people in this area, and just the access and making sure that the watershed is there for future generations.
Yes.
And making sure it's accessible for future generations. This is totally circling back to the very beginning, but you said as a youngster, you grew up at just off of Highway 136. And that's pretty close to where the Valley Community Presbyterian Church is located off of Lilac Drive.
I know the church. That's where I vote.
Okay. So that's been like a constant figure in your life.
Yes, I was riding my bike in front of that and the park behind it.
Yeah.
Years ago, it was called Woodlawn Park. Now it's starts with a G. I don't even know the name of the park, but it's the park that I played at as a child and went ice skating in the winter. And that church was always right there.
Yeah, it was built in the early 1950s.
Yeah,
so
it's right on Lilac Drive there.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
So exciting. Well, is there anything else that you would like to share that I may have missed or we didn't touch on?
No, I think really just you speaking about keeping, making sure that this exists,
Mhm.
and the recognition that before all the homes were built here, and recognizing that there were people here.
Right.
This was someone's land in the sense of living and moving, because with Native people, especially in the woodlands, that we move season to season. So
Mhm.
and water was always so important. And so I know that it goes all the way to Medicine Lake,
Right.
and all the
And to the
way to
Mississippi
the
River.
Mississippi,
Mhm.
and all things that and so just that care and accessibility
Mhm.
and honoring of the Native people who want to come back to it and
Mhm.
honor it.
Yeah, it also makes me think about, you and your children, your sons didn't grow up with Indian education programming, but now you have these grandchildren who are, but they
Yeah.
wonder like, well, why are we getting pulled out? Why aren't we learning this in our regular class? But even something so highly accessible as this creek, or
Yeah.
seemingly accessible, right? We could have access to it, that folks could learn so much from just by being on the land, both native and non-native
Yes.
children.
Yeah, because it's having that history told, and the inclusion of everyone learning our history. We know everyone else's history. That's one of the things my grandkids have said, we learn about everybody else, but how can we just go?
Right.
And it's like, that's a good question, but I'm glad that you get to go,
Right.
because they've got to go mapling, and, they've got to do lots of things. And so I'm grateful for that. But it is still a little strange that the interest of,
Mhm.
is anybody else interested in us?
Yeah. Well, hopefully we see change
Yeah,
in the coming years, and while they're still, in school.
yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. Well, there's change. You had mentioned that in Anoka that you had, so
Yeah.
where I know you're younger than I am, but my children in Hopkins area did not.
Right.
So it's interesting.
It is. And
But
what,
there's progress.
right. I think a lot, it sounds like, is also based on geography and where you're living.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Cathee.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
Naya chopnapi cha wopira tanka unkeni chiapi. Thank you for listening. This project may serve as a model for other communities that seek to go beyond land acknowledgement. To learn more about this oral history project, please contact Hennepin History Museum. The project was produced following the standards and principles of the Oral History Association. In addition to this podcast, the interview recordings, transcripts, and narrator files included signed legal released agreements can be found at the Hennepin History Museum. Funding and other support was provided by the St. Anthony's Falls Heritage Board, Hennepin History Museum, Valley Community Presbyterian Church, and the University of Wisconsin. This publication was also made possible in part by the people of Minnesota through a grant funded by an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Any views, findings, opinions, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this publication are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent those of the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, or the Minnesota Historic Resources Advisory Committee. Anaya chopta pecha wopira unkenichiapi. Thank you for listening.